Welcome, everyone. Excited to have this conversation. I'm Jeremy Allaire. I'm co-founder and CEO at Circle, and I'm joined here with the key leaders behind TBD, a new division of Block that's working on some pretty exciting infrastructure for crypto finance, payments, the future of the financial system, which we're going to get into. But here, joined by Mike Brock, who's GM at TBD, and Emily Chiu, who's head of operations and strategy at TBD. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, as we talked about, this is hopefully going to be just a good conversation. And I think maybe just to start, I think you guys announced TBD I think 9 months ago. Is that about right?
Yeah.
And just I want to kind of orient here a little bit. I think, from my perspective, obviously coming out of Block, really in many ways, like one of the most significant pioneers in making the payment experience in the world better. And I think that was sort of the origin of the company as Square, and just sort of like really trying to solve things in seamless ways. And little funny story, I ended up hiring some people at Circle at some point who kind of had come out of Square, and they used to talk about how Jack would talk about payments in the founding of Square, and sort of this kind of vision of sort of internet native money, and that payments could essentially be frictionless and free. And obviously, we live in a world where there are a lot of legacy payment systems, and improving on those and building better UX on those is one phase of sort of fintech. But now we're in this like new phase where we're basically building the infrastructure from the ground up, like truly from the ground up, with like internet native money, and kind of taking legacy fiat money and making that more internet native money, and actually like really re-envisioning the plumbing of how this whole financial system can work. And so I think the fact that TBD kind of came out of Square/Block, to me was extremely exciting, because I think a lot of people are, when they're thinking about, what are the problems to solve, a lot of people talk about where's the utility, and how's it going to work, and how's it going to work for real people in the real world. And like solving those problems are really hard. And it struck me that with the vision that you guys outlined, like you were really working on some infrastructure that could truly address that. So first, just I kudos to the vision and what you're working on. But maybe just for people here and for people tuning in, online and watching this later, talk about that, connect the dots, that sort of that origin of Square, and then kind of what this represents for this kind of new financial system, and how you're building it. Mike?
Yeah, I love that you started there, because I've been at the company for 8 years, and I haven't said this in a while, but maybe I should say it more. One of the things that I think we've been really, really good at as a company since our inception has been really focusing on this concept of access. Mm-hmm. I used to say that people talk about us as a financial services company, and I like to think of us as like a financial access company. Really thinking about like what does it mean to provide access? If I know this is a Bitcoin conference, but if you go back to the origin of Square and like and where we were like as a financial services industry back in the aughts, I hope I don't mangle this statistic, but I think it's true that in 2009, when we were founded, only about 60% of small businesses were able to get merchant accounts to be able to accept credit cards, right? That left a large segment of the SMB market, faced with just only being able to accept cash, which meant that they had to turn away a lot. Like people didn't always carry cash, so they had to turn away sales. And Jack and Jim McKelvey, I don't want to retrade the origin story. It's all out there in a million different places, but really recognizing that like the way we should really like think about our what our role is. It's to connect people to the financial system. And when we started to recognize in 2017 that there was a new financial system that was emerging from the ground up with a Bitcoin, it became very clear for us that our mission had to expand. There was a new financial system that was coming to bear, and we had to find ways to provide access to that system. And that's what we did. We did that in Cash App. We became the first publicly traded company to provide access to Bitcoin to consumers in the United States. So that continues to be our DNA. I think that's what TBD is. This is about building access. And there's too many people who still can't access it. They still can't access Bitcoin because they're still faced with KYC and difficult onboarding problems, complex issues like key management, and identity is obviously a big one. I know we're going to talk a little bit about that. But to me, that's the story arc.
Yeah, I think economic empowerment is really the through line. And many of us came from the Cash App team where we did an incredible job of unlocking access to banking services for so many Americans and so many people who didn't have access. But even so, we found that you couldn't onboard everyone that you wanted to. And as we were thinking about the greater secular trends around decentralization, around the promise of blockchain technologies and Bitcoin in order to solve some of these last mile problems, especially for those that lack fundamental access to the banking system despite our best efforts, and don't even have an identity in some cases to allow them to be seen and heard and to actually benefit from the services that we all enjoyed. We really felt like we needed a new business unit to be thinking about this de novo, to be thinking about this in an open source way, and instead of trying to work with the existing plumbing, reinventing the financial infrastructure to really unlock access for everyone that the current world can't reach.
Yeah, I mean, I think that economic empowerment and reach and enabling that is so fundamental. I wanted to just touch on a couple of the design choices that you guys have been making and kind of the overall, some of the fundamental philosophy behind the project as well. I think notably, right, TBD is it's a set of open source projects, right? Now, a lot of people in crypto are like, well, all crypto projects are open source, or smart contracts are open source, or all these different token projects are open source, and that's sort of true, right? But you guys made a really important design decision in my mind, which is that you're trying to build a set of standards and a set of infrastructure where you're not pumping a token.
Yeah.
Right. There's not oh, we're going to do this clever thing with a token that's going to incentivize people. This is straight through classic open standards, open source software in this spirit of open internet infrastructure that we've built up, and that's a major design choice.
Yeah.
And I'd love just if you could just take a minute to talk about that specific philosophy, the philosophy that sits behind it. It's been amazing to see some of the people that you've been hiring as well, because it speaks to that as well. But just, I think that's really important. And then, maybe as a follow-on, and either of you can take this, maybe Emily, you can take this, is just as a set of open source infrastructure, where do you think the incentives come from? Because people are like, well, you need a token to have an incentive. I think we were talking the other day, and I was saying, originally USDC, when we built it, was going to have a token called the cent. And we abandoned that because we don't actually need a token. This is a protocol for dollars and it should work. But maybe walk through a little bit of that design philosophy, and then ultimately, as this kind of comes into the world, and I know it's already, some of the libraries are getting out there, but as it comes into the world, what is the basis for how people are going to come together and build on this?
Yeah, I mean, I love this question as well. I think that I'll be honest, I think a lot of people in this industry have lost their way, right? The term blockchain has become almost synonymous with decentralization, and that's obviously wrong. There are many, many technologies and solutions that can achieve decentralization, and they do. I mean, the internet itself, TCP/IP, is a decentralizing protocol. There's no tokens that you need to buy in order to packets.
Everything we use on the internet is largely based on these decentralized, permissionless, software-based protocols that are open source.
Yeah, and so I look at the design decisions as we made with TBD as like going back to basics.
Yeah.
It's like we know how to build decentralized systems. Like, blockchain is obviously like an amazing technology. It's why we're here today. Like we believe in it, like obviously. But what is it? Like what is it good at? It's a decentralized ledger that creates like a censorship-resistant source of truth for like fundamentally like final settlement. And it does that really, really well. Like, and the problem has been solved like amazingly. But there's this whole other like set of problems that we need to solve, like from, what we're doing with TBDEX, which is like, the negotiation of trust and like building trust relationships, establishing social trust so we can actually like, conduct low-risk transactions at scale. And the reality is there's great technologies for doing that. We don't need what we're trying to do is bring two parties together to engage in an economic transaction. We don't need any additional sources of truth rather than the final settlement layer. What we need is like the ability to like pass messages between them securely, to be able to identify each other in a high fidelity way. I'm gonna like name drop you, Jeremy. Like we're working with you guys on the Verity stuff, in order to conduct KYC in a way which is like more like decentralized and open and privacy preserving.
Right. Also a set of standards and protocols that don't have a token but are just open source and defined protocols.
Yeah, and I think too many people have for the last few years have kind of started from the assumption of like, okay, like we need to build like tokenomics, and that's how it's going to create these incentive structures to propel the network. And the reality is that's not a Swiss Army knife. There's like a very specific problem that it solves, and I think there is massive pent-up demand for finding ways to like negotiate economic transactions in a decentralized way, and not just like crypto native people, but like real, like tangible, like, actors in the economy today are currently like trapped in an old payment system. They're trapped in the attendant risks of that. We're in our merchant services side square, like, dealing with chargeback risk and fraud and money laundering, all these things that are really like just hard to deal with this 1970s era payment system that exists. There's just so much pent-up demand for that, and so we think that we now have the technological primitives where we can bring it together and we can build something which is open, like standards-based, permissionless, and really just following in the footsteps of all these amazing protocols that built the internet, like HTTP and the underlying like protocol layers, and that's how we think of TBDEX. Like, let's build an open protocol for mediating those sorts of activities, and we think. And we think we're going in the right direction.
It's really going back to first principles and thinking about open source, especially for Square, not as a publishing platform, but really thinking about how do we accelerate and catalyze like the foundational pieces that are missing for the next billion people to be able to easily get and benefit from crypto technologies. And as Mike mentioned, it's not about crypto natives who are quite adept at navigating things despite the difficult UX. And it's also about getting away from centralized platforms, right? Like, how do we actually decentralize the onboarding and the offboarding such that the average person for use cases such as remittances, right? Being able to solve for fiat to fiat remittances, leveraging the benefit of crypto, can do so without having to figure out how to navigate a centralized exchange, followed by just the ubiquity of complicated apps that they have to navigate today. And to Mike's point, we don't want to be a permission network. We're doing this because we want to see it happen. If someone wanted to copy our playbook, do this for us, like we'd love to see that because we want this to be in existence and we think it would benefit the entire ecosystem.
Yeah, totally. We used to have this phrase when we were getting started 9 years ago, which was like, there needs to be an HTTP of money. And like that, it was always like this thing, and it's never like entirely clear. And like even like HTTP itself, like that's like it's like, yes, you needed that. You needed HTML as well. You needed like payload, right? And then you needed like a trust layer. You needed SSL, which then came along, and people said, okay, I can trust this. It's federated trust, right? And so in some ways, there's like a collection of things that are needed. And I feel like, as you guys have outlined what you're doing, right, there's sort of like a messaging layer, which is a little bit like the HTTP kind of thing. And then there's the payload, which is like Bitcoin and stables. And then there's the trust layer, which is like decentralized identity. And like, it's this amalgam of things, and you need all of those. And
I'm stealing that analogy.
Isn't that good?
Yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, it's true. I think that's kind of what you're trying to piece together here. And obviously, we're trying to do our part, and hopefully can be a big part of it. But I think what needs to happen on the other side of that? Proliferation of like well-designed stablecoins, like identity wallets. Like who needs to connect to this? Imagine, you've rolled some stuff out, and it's 18 months from now. What does it look like?
I mean, I think it's interesting because when we were writing the TBDEX protocol, we call it a liquidity protocol, but we also considered calling it a trust protocol. And this is where decentralized identity plays such a core piece to this. We often use the analogy, you can't atomically swap a teddy bear for Bitcoin, right? Like when you're dealing with assets in the real world, you actually have to establish who the person is. Yeah. And absent doing that, you're always going to be subject to intermediaries, a ubiquity of centralized entities that haven't been the best custodians of our data. And so while TBDEX is about unlocking a ubiquity of liquidity through on-ramps and off-ramps that are decentralized, we actually think that decentralized identity and the technologies we can unlock there are possibly even bigger than TBDEX and bigger than everything we're talking about here.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the one thing I will add is like, I sometimes people, their mind goes to like a very dark place when they hear us talking about like decentralized identity and like verifiable credentials, and I think you really need to contextualize with like where we are today, right? Like you do not own your information. Facebook owns your information. Google owns your information. Your identity. They own your identity too. You're probably logging into a lot of apps with your Google account or your Facebook account, and you've given them full control of your identity. And so people, and so there's this like, and I feel like people are just doing this like muscle memory. And the reality is that,
surveillance capital.
Yeah. And the reality is like what we're building with decentralized identity is so the antithesis to that. This is not about like enabling surveillance. Like decentralized identity is about giving you control over your identity, giving you control over your privacy, you deciding who knows what about you.
This is like, in the early days of crypto and talking about how could something like crypto be better as a payment system, and there's this underlying theme, and I think this is really important for Bitcoin. I think it's really important as a first principle for even for stablecoins as well, which is privacy preservation is like so fundamental. And right now, as you guys know well from some of your existing businesses and product lines, right? Every time you use your credit card or your debit card, or every time you even just have a bank-to-bank transaction, right? Your personal identifiable information is proliferating.
Yep.
It's proliferating everywhere, and it's creating honeypots of data, and we see that through data breaches and other things that happen, but we don't have privacy preservation. It may feel like it's private when I like give my card, right? That's because all I did is I swiped this thing, right? Mm-hmm. But like there's the privacy preservation isn't there, so you're losing that. And so like decentralized identity, we need to be able to prove our identities, right, for trust, right? And we can have trustless transactions with an underlying bearer asset like Bitcoin, which is true, but certain kinds of transactions, like getting the teddy bear, or example, or certain types of services, right? That kind of proof that I'm a real person, or that I'm a person in good standing, not breaking the law or whatever. Like you have to be able to have that in many contexts. But the challenge is like, how do you do that where you still have very, very high levels of privacy guarantees? Mm-hmm. And I think that's what we're trying to work on with Verity, and you're trying to work on in building a way to put that to work in this new kind of financial infrastructure. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, this is like really important. Like I used one of my first jobs was working in like like there's this whole industry that people don't know about, which is like this list matching industry, right? Like companies like Dun and Bradstreet
Terrifying.
Info USA and all these companies that like, and if you're ever able to get access to your consumer report that these people have, you would just like literally, you would probably fall out of your seat, like with the profiles that they have on you. Yeah. The marketing industry has this entire sort of like CIA level like intelligence on like every consumer in this country, and yeah, like you're like people always joke about how like they see ads like that completely are relevant to what they were talking about 30 minutes later, because they know everything about you, right? And you don't have control over your identity and your privacy today, but the reality is like we do need to have a concept of identity, because we do need to have ways to trust each other through the digital realm and establish that social trust. But we need to rebalance the power. Like we need to put the individual back in control over their information. And so, yeah, I mean, we're laser focused on that, and we realize that if we're going to fully realize the potential of this decentralized system that everyone here, like I assume in this room, believes is the future, this is like the next big problem that needs to be solved.
And I think to state the obvious, like we live in a world still where we can't pay taxes in Bitcoin. You can't pay for groceries yet in Bitcoin. You can't pay your rent in Bitcoin. And until we're all just digital avatars and AIs eating digital food, you can't atomically swap Bitcoin for all the things you still need to exist in the real world. And that, I think, is where the protocol is just brilliant in being able to solve that last mile trust problem.
Yeah.
And how you actually think about swapping immutable transactions that are instant for things where there still is transaction risk, and there still is settlement time, and there still is the need to prove your counterparty is who they are and they have title to the asset you're trying to get.
Yeah.
And that actually is the big idea with TBDEX.
Yeah. I think the use cases are very broad. Yeah, they really are. With the last kind of few minutes, just I want to touch on stablecoins specifically, and the role of stablecoins in TBDEX relative to, one, just like a decentralized Bitcoin native DEX, right? That can have stablecoin liquidity as well. And what do you think about, say, USDC on a Bitcoin architecture?
Yeah, I mean, like, I'm excited about the prospect. And and obviously there's actually been quite a bit of talk at this conference. I'm sure people have seen some of the other announcements around stablecoins on some of the a layer 2 technology. So I think it's really important. I think basically bringing like tokenizing fiat into the Bitcoin system is going to be an amazing accelerator for Bitcoin adoption. Like at the end of the day, like if you believe that this is the future, then you should believe that the incentives will drive towards that adoption, and the more slippery those on-ramps become, and stablecoins certainly make those on-ramps more slippery, that's good for Bitcoin, that's good for decentralization, lowers transaction costs, lowers settlement risk, lowers counterparty risk. Like all of these things like add up to what ultimately creates a more accessible, cheaper, safer financial system. Mm-hmm. And so I think the stablecoins are an important bridge to that world. Mm-hmm. And it's why we're investing so heavily in them, even as we look towards a future where we believe Bitcoin, we think it's the native currency of the internet, as Jack keeps saying, but we also realize we need to build bridges, and stablecoins are the most powerful bridges that we're building.
I think it goes again back to first principles and what is the customer use case that we're trying to solve. And especially as we think about financial empowerment and use cases for people like in Argentina, you speak to anyone there and they'll tell you it's impossible to be from Argentina and be a Bitcoin maxi, right? There's different use cases for stable coins that can also bridge to Bitcoin, and we're really, really excited about facilitating those use cases.
Yeah, I forget who it was, but sort of saying, Bitcoin is sort of the reserve currency of the internet, and sort of the dollar is the reserve currency of the sort of the legacy financial system. But if you can have like a version of the dollar that also works on the internet, it sort of is actually complementary to Bitcoin.
Yes.
And those can work really well together. So, well, look, super excited about where you guys are and what you're building, and looking forward to what's going to be next. And thanks for a good conversation.
Yeah. Thanks, Jeremy.
Thank you. Thanks for having
so
us.
Thanks.